We're going to be talking about Pesach and things about the Chag Pesach itself, and we will be trying to examine some critical questions about Pesach. I think the most important question that you have to ask about Pesach really is the following. Every year, on the 14th day and the 15th day of Nisan, we celebrate Pesach, and essentially what Pesach is, what it commemorates, is basically the fact that the Jews were redeemed and they went out of Egypt. They were in Egypt for 210 years. For a large period of time, they were inside Mitzrayim in Egypt, and then for the last 80 years they were enslaved in actual work, and it was just a horrible experience. And the Baruch Hashem took them out through Moshe Rabbeinu, to Prophet Moshe Rabbeinu. He took them out of Egypt, and he took them out through 10 plagues which he brought about in Egypt. And then, after they left 12 midnight, Chatzot Halayla, 12 midnight, went into the desert, and after they went out, several days later, they came to the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, and they looked around and they saw the Egyptians running after them again. And they were extremely frightened, and Moshe Rabbeinu said, don't worry about it, the Baruch Hashem will perform very great mitzvah. Suddenly the sea split, the Jews went into the sea to the other side, and there's many, many miracles related to this. It's an awesome story, but I will not go into this now. And the Egyptians ran after them, and all the water came back down on their heads, and the Egyptian army was destroyed. This is the basic story of Pesach. And it goes on. After that, they went on to Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. The Baruch Hashem gave them the Torah, and this is basically what the ultimate objective was. Now, this is very briefly some of the historical events of Pesach. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. If you're not, you should just read up the Chumash or anything that relates to the history of it. But we want to have a deeper view of things. We want to look at it from a deeper standpoint, and essentially what we have to ask ourselves is the following. What are we celebrating? We're celebrating the fact that the Jews left Egypt after 210 years, and we were finally formed as a nation. And in my opinion, I fail to understand what we should celebrate about. Totally fail to understand, because the fundamental question we have to ask is, why were we in there in the first place? Why did the Baruch Hashem put us in there? He told Avram that he's going to put us in for a certain amount of time and then take us out. So what we do is we thank God for taking us out. But before we can thank God for taking us out, I think we have to understand why He put us in there. And basically we would say, don't put us in, and we won't have to thank you for taking us out. You know, we would prefer never to have gone in there for 210 years and had this horrible experience, so that you would then have to come and take us out. So I think the most important question that we really have to ask on Pesach is not so much the fact that we're celebrating Yetzias Mitzrayim or the redemption from Egypt, but why were we in there in the first place? That is the most critical question that we have to ask. Now, there are a number of different reasons given, and I find all of these reasons given extremely inadequate. Some of the reasons given is that in order for the Jews to excel as a nation, they had to live in Egypt, and they had to be, in a sense, broken as men, and they had to be slaves. And in doing that, it would, in a certain sense, strengthen them as a nation. That suffering would strengthen them as a nation, so they would be able to go out and become the nation of Israel by receiving Torah. And this is obviously a very strange kind of answer, because, I mean, a nation is not created necessarily through suffering as such. The Jews basically had no real reason to go into Egypt in the first place. If the Baruch Hashem wanted to establish them as a nation, He could have done that without bringing them into Egypt and undergoing such a difficult time. The other thing is, well, wait a minute, we know that a person gets suffering, he suffers because of the fact that he has to atone for certain sins. That's the other side of the coin, right? But that can't be true, because who went into Egypt? Jacob went into Egypt, Yaakov went in with his 12 sons and their children. They were all tzaddikim. So then what were they suffering for? The 70 souls that went into Egypt were tremendous tzaddikim, all of them. So what were they suffering for? What could they have done that they are punished, you see, with 210 years of servitude? Come on, what is this exactly? What does this mean? So we can't say that in some way they were really atoning for anything. So, if they're not going in there for any really self-development, if they're not going for any atonement, so why are they there? If we really can't answer this question, the truth of the matter is, we really have no business making a Seder, honestly. Now, of course, you have to make a Seder, it's a mitzvah. But how can anyone really sit down to a Seder on Pesach without having this answer? Because in a certain sense, we don't understand why we were there and what we were supposed to be doing there. We can never really understand what was the big situation, the great gratitude we owe for God because He took us out. I think we all understand the question. The basic question is, why were we put into the land of Egypt for so many years? What purpose could it have served? It could not have served the purposes of building a nation. It could not have served the purpose of atonement, because the children of the 70 souls who entered into Egypt were tzaddikim. So what purpose did it serve? At all. Let's see if we can't answer this question. In order to understand this question, we've got to go back in time. Not with a time machine, we've got to go back in time with a idea machine. We've got to go back in time to Adam HaRishon, the first man. And what we do is we start with the first man, okay, and we say to ourselves, what was he supposed to do? Okay. Very briefly, the Baruch created a person so that he can give him an eternal life. He created him with a body and a soul, you see, so that he can then give that person an existence which is eternal, without end. And in existence, he would be able to experience the most ecstatic feeling that is possible for human beings at all. The situation where this ecstasy takes place is called Olam Haba, the future world. We have gone into it extensively, and I'm not going to go into extensively now what this is. It is an extraordinary deep thing. But basically, what we do know is that God created the neshama itself, a being who had a sense of self-awareness so that he can give it great goodness. And the good that God wanted to give to the neshama was the awareness of the presence of God Himself. Not the total presence of God, but an aspect of His presence. And when the neshama is aware or perceives experientially the presence of God, that automatically creates an incredible ecstatic experience. That is the highest form of pleasure, the highest form of beauty. You see. Whether you all know it or not, all of you, in all the different ways you experience pleasure, are really experiencing it through the perception of God in one way or another, except that you don't know it. As I said a long time ago, every bodily pleasure really has in it, contained within it, the experience or the feeling of Kedusha in it. In some way you are plugging in to the Kedusha that emanates from God's power, and the body is able to take that and retranslate it into bodily pleasures. You see. But when the body experiences its Kedusha, it doesn't know that it's Kedusha. And it thinks that it's a material, physical thing. It doesn't know it. And the neshama can experience the pleasure unadulterated, pure, so that the neshama knows that this pleasure is from God. And the difference between the neshama and the body, you see, is that they both experience fundamentally the same type of pleasure from the same source, except that the neshama experiences the access to God directly, when the neshama is in the body, the person can experience the kedusha which emanates from God, in a sense, indirectly. So the neshama's capacity is infinitesimally, exponentially greater than the ability to experience this kind of simcha when you're in the body, you see. And we've expanded this many times before, but this is the essential idea. The most incredible experience that you will all have is that when Mashiach arrives, you will suddenly, all of you understand that every physical pleasure that you ever had was nothing more than the experience of ruchnius, of spirituality itself, in hidden form. And that in Olam Haba, it's the experience of spiritual pleasure in revealed form. That's the only difference. You see. It's not that suddenly we're going to experience something totally different from what we have now. It's the same thing, only exponentially greater, because it's revealed, whereas now it's hidden. You see? It's like seeing a beautiful light with incredible dense filters. So we see this light and we get pleasure from that light. But since the filter is so dense, we no longer see the source. But suddenly when you take the filter away and you see the source of light itself, you realize that it was the same thing you were experiencing with the filter. But it's much, much greater because there is no filter. That's the exact difference between the simcha, or the pleasure, or the joy that the neshama experiences directly from God, and which the neshama experiences in the guf, indirectly from God. So we understand this. Very, very critical. Adam Rishon was created as a person where his neshama was put into a guf, and the Baruch Shem said to him, I want you to do certain things. I will not give you this pleasure that I have in store called Olam Haba, which is the ultimate pleasure, unless you earn it, unless you create it yourself. That's called Nam B'Sufa. We've gone over this before. Essentially that's what it is. What God said is that to man, you must earn this reward yourself. You must earn it as a compensation, not as a gift. I have an incredible thing in store for you, but you must develop it, you must produce it. And this is the essence of the matter. So what God did was take the neshama, put it into a body where God was no longer visible, and He put Adam into the Garden of Eden and told him not to eat from the Eitz Hadas Tov, from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And He said, I want you to listen to my will. If you listen to my will, if you correctly establish my relationship with yours, if you understand who I am and who you are, that I am your God and I created you, and that your ultimate existence and simcha, joy, can only come from me, and therefore you follow my will, you see, then what will happen is you will be able to draw down a new light from the spiritual universe that will enter your neshama, and what that light will do is completely dematerialize your physical body. So that suddenly the filter is gone, and you will see my light through your body without any physicality. Do we understand this? This is what Adam Rishon should have done. It's an extraordinary idea, you see. It's an extraordinary idea. Adam had the power to transform physical reality so that the body no longer constitutes a barrier to that great light. The filter is removed. The famous word in Hebrew that's called is called zichuch. Zichuch means purification. And that's what Adam should have done. Had he done the mitzvah, had he listened to God's will, he would have brought out a new spiritual power. And that spiritual power would have allowed him to transform his body and literally connect to the power of God directly and experience an incredible joy and ecstasy forever. But Adam didn't do that. He failed to do that. He didn't listen to God's will. He rather established his own independence, and he said that I am a force to be reckoned with. I am my own power. And he essentially rebelled against what God said, and he ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What happened? Therefore, one man was supposed to acquire one world. But you say, where was the rest of mankind? The answer is, all mankind was Adam Rishon. It's a very strange thing for us to understand, but once, imagine if you took all the souls of the world, of all the people that live today, and all the souls of all the people that live for all time, and you put it all together in one bundle, yes? That bundle, or that super soul, is called Adam Rishon. That's who he was. He was everyone rolled into one. You can imagine what an extraordinary being he was. You see. That one person has a job to create, transform his physical universe and create Olam Haba. So all of Olam Haba serviced one man. When he failed to do what he did, what the Baruch Shem did said, no longer will you alone have this task, but I will give this task to many people. I will fragment your neshama. I will fragment your soul, and what will happen is all these different souls that now will come from you will become separate people, and they will have to do collectively what you failed to do individually. Okay? So what the Baruch Shem did was to divide Adam into different people. Okay? Now, all of these people, children of Adam, had the same capacity as Adam, except that each one now only has a fraction of that capacity. Now here's the critical thing. When God divided Adam Rishon into different people, into a collective entity called mankind, he correspondingly divided the Olam Haba, didn't he? Because it's literally a one-to-one correspondence. So, what God said was that Adam, the job of Adam was to create Olam Haba, singly. He failed, therefore, the Banishim redistributed that task to his children. When he did that, now Olam Haba would have to be created by his children. Well, now each one of his children now creates a specific fraction of Olam Haba, so therefore Olam Haba is now also divided into, you see, different components. So therefore Olam Haba suffers a corresponding fragmentation. As Adam Rishon is fragmented, so is Olam Haba. You see this? This is a corresponding or concomitant fragmentation. All of his children had the ability to create that Olam Haba. When they failed to do it, you see, the Banishim did something else. When they failed to do it, he went on to the next level. So the level of Adam Rishon is the first level, the level of his children is the second level, and that's the level until Avraham Avinu. Adam was first, 20 generations later, we come to the end of the second level. What God saw was that all the people who came from Adam Rishon failed also to create an Olam Haba, collectively. So the Banishim says, I'm going to separate mankind into two different units. What I'm going to do is I'm going to separate mankind now into two units. One unit, you see, will have the ability to create Olam Haba, and the other will no longer have that ability. Okay? The Banishim then separated mankind into two different species. Different species with respect to their ability to transform Olam Haba. One species is called the Jew, and the other species is the Gentile. And that is the difference between a Goy and a Jew. A Jew is simply an individual who retains the original power of Adam Rishon to create Olam Haba. The Gentile is an individual who has lost that ability. You see, that's the critical point. Which means that now Olam Haba only follows the Jew. The Gentiles are excluded from the creation of Olam Haba. Although they can reside in it, they are excluded from it. So therefore, at the outset, Adam Rishon had the individual task of doing it. The next stage was the collective task. But all of mankind was equal to that task. Finally, by the time of the Dor HaFloga, when the people of the world rebelled against God, they wanted to build the Tower of Babel, what happened? God decided to divide mankind a third time and eliminate or confiscate the ability to create Olam Haba and simply retain it with only one section of mankind, the children of Abraham. So, Olam Haba, with its concomitant fragmentation, would reflect this exact reassignment with mankind. You see that? You must always remember, there are always two things here now. There's Adam and there's Olam Haba. Man and his ultimate destiny. As man is affected, so is the structure of his ultimate destiny. And there's a concomitant variation of the structure. Point for point. But there was one big problem. One strange problem that we all overlooked. And what is that? And this is at the core of it. God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you and your children the ability to create Olam Haba, to transform physical reality and create an eternal spiritual world where you can access my presence directly. You see. Now wait, you must ask. You have to ask me the question. 1 second. Hold on. What were the percentages here? I mean, hey, this was a partnership, right? In stage 2, when mankind was homogeneous, meaning that all of mankind was equal to the task, then Olam Haba was split, or was actually distributed among mankind equally, where each person had his own share. But wait, if you're going to take away the shares of 90% of mankind, you see, right? What happens is, and you're going to give what? Let the Jews keep their share. Well, that means that fundamentally the Jews only have 10% of Olam Haba, you see. Because Olam Haba takes the same split. So if the Gentiles had 90% of Olam Haba, the Goyim, and the children of Abraham and Avram only had 10%, well, what are you dealing with now? Now you're dealing with the fact that Olam Haba now goes on to the Jews, it's 10%, and 90% of the Goyim is lost. That means Olam Haba was, 90% of it was cut off, because there was no one to claim it. You know, it's like territory, land. The land is given over to 100 people, each one having 1/100th of the land, correct? Or rather, let's say the land is given over to 10 people. Each one has 1/10 of the land, 1/10 of the property. Now, suddenly we decide that 9 of these people are no longer worthy to own this property, only one. So we say to the one guy, you keep the 10 that you have, and the other 9/10 are gone. Why? Because the 9 owners are gone. That means that Olam Haba is divided, so that 9/10 of it is now missing. You see the point? So you may say, well, what's the problem with that? So Avram will take his 1/10. So what? So he has 1/10, he'll continue as 1/10, the other 9/10 evaporate. Or God rolls it back up, or whatever you want to say. The answer is that it cannot be done like that. It can't. All the land of Olam Haba must be claimed. It must be claimed. You see, when God took it away from the Goyim, the 90% of the Goyim, that means 90% of Olam Haba lay fallow. No one to claim it. But somebody must claim it. Somebody must claim it. Why? Now this is a very deep and mysterious thing, and I don't have a full understanding of this. But what we do know is the following, is that Olam Haba, which is the future world, is a world with a certain structural unity. You see. It's not a world where you can divide into sections or pieces as such, you see. Where you can develop a certain part and leave the rest of it idle. You can't. There's something about Olam Haba which is one world together, so that either all of it is developed or none of it is developed. It has a structural unity to it. Why has that structural unity to it? I don't know. It's not clear. You see. But it must be that way. All of Olam Haba is developed, not a part of it. Now we have a big problem, don't we? Because Avram only has 10% of it. What's going to happen to the other 90%? So the Bonishim goes and says to Avram, you've got to fix up the other 90% too. Because if you don't fix up the other 90%, you won't get your 10%. In other words, when you have a building, you see, if you don't build the foundation, you won't have a building. You can't be 10% of a foundation and have a building. You can't do that. You've got to build a whole foundation, you see. Which means that you've got to do the job that they all missed. So Avram got very, very nervous. And he said, wait. It's one thing if I got to do my own job, but you want me to do the job of everyone else? So the Brother Shem says, so Avram says, wait a minute, how will I survive? How can I see to it that my children will survive if we got to take on this enormous responsibility? So God said to him, at the Bris Ben Absalom, at the covenant of the pieces, He said to him, wait, He says, look, don't worry. You have this job, but I promise you, you will not fail. One way or another, I will see to it that your children will have fixed up the whole 100% of Olam Haba. That's what God said about Abraham. Do we all understand? Do we all understand the basic premise? Very important. That Olam Haba, which is the future eternal life, has a structural unity to it. It cannot be built in degrees or stages or pieces. That's number one. Number two, that the structure of Olam Haba is directly related to the structure of mankind. Number three, mankind somehow forced God to disqualify a whole segment of it. So the problem is now, what happens to Olam Haba? And the ultimate answer is that Avram and his children must do the job by fixing it all up. That's the idea. And by fixing it all up, he and his children will take the whole piece of Olam Haba.
100%. But what God says is that you must take the 100%. Because if you don't take the 100% of Olam Haba, you won't even have your 10%. You see, that's the problem. And God promised Avram that He will help him and see to it that he will not fail. Now, the question that we have to ask is, what is the basic mechanism? How does God intend this happen? How does He intend this happen? Well, okay. Now, how is Adam supposed to create Olam Haba? How is he supposed to transform his physical body and create the eternal life? How? Through Kedusha. Through a specific Kedusha that would have come down and entered his neshama that would have given the power to do that. Well, when Adam was fragmented into different people, that Kedusha was also fragmented, wasn't it? Just like he was. So that by the time you get down to Avram and the Jews, they only had a certain amount of that Kedusha. You see, what happened to all the other Kedusha? The 90% of all that Kedusha, the power that was necessary to transform, to build that Olam Haba. You see what I'm saying? That's the problem. Where did that Kedusha go? When the Goyim lost the ability to create Olam Haba, they lost the ability to access this Kedusha, which is needed to create Olam Haba. So where is the Kedusha? Where did it go? You see. And what God is saying, what the Baruch is saying to Avram, is that you've got to get that Kedusha. And by you getting your Kedusha, you will build Olam Haba. That's what it is. The key to the game is in the Kedusha. So what does the Baruch say? I will take that Kedusha and I will put it into... Wait. When a person does a sin, he loses that Kedusha. Where does that Kedusha go? Who gets that Kedusha? You remember we said that Kedusha goes to the Satan. When a person does a sin, then the Kedusha, which a person should have gotten he should have gotten if he had not sinned, if he had done the mitzvah, goes to the accusing angel, to the Satan. You see. So, if you have a person, and he does a sin, his Kedusha goes to the Satan. Now the Satan takes that Kedusha and is able to come back to the person and cause him suffering. You see. Now, but what God has done is a different process, where He had set up certain nations of the world, certain nations, of the world, as a vessel for that Kedusha. We have spoken about this at length. But what happens is, when a person sins, that Kedusha goes spiritually back to the Satan. And the Satan then transfers that Kedusha to a nation which he in some way is deeply associated with. So that nation now possesses this Kedusha. What happens then is that then that person becomes subject in some way to dominion by that nation. That nation is able to dominate him in some way. And by dominating him, is able to return the Kedusha that it was given. Let me just give a simple example. It is a process of triangulation. A simple example. When a person does a sin, let me give you an example. When a person does a sin, then the power of that sin, the power of Kedusha, which he gave away, goes to the accusing angel. Because the accusing angel goes in front of God and says, you see that person? That person just committed a sin. And the accusation, if it's found to be true, you see, allows the Satan to suddenly go down into his neshama, that person's neshama, and slice off a piece of the Kedusha of that neshama. He's able to slice off a piece and hold onto that piece. He's able to do that. Now what the Satan then does, many times, is that he will connect to another person who is, let's say, an evil person, and he will transfer that Kedusha over to that evil person. A third evil person. Now, that third evil person has the Kedusha of that person who sinned. So therefore, that third person is able to go over to the person who sinned and cause him trouble. He has power over him. He's able to control him. God allows that third person, that evil person, to literally control the person who just sinned. Do we see what we're saying? Do we see this process? Now you may say, why does God do this? Because what this allows them is that when that third person, that evil person, comes over and causes the person suffering, slowly that Kedusha, which he has, goes back to the person. That's the way that God retrieves the Kedusha back to someone who lost it. That is a triangulation process. That is what exists on an individual level. But there's something which exists on a national level. That what God said to Abraham is the following: if your children do sins, if your children are not able to uphold what I'm saying, then the Kedusha which they have lost, you see, I will put into a nation. And that nation will then suppress the Jews. And as they suppress the Jews will take back that Kedusha. We see what it's saying? We see the triangulation process. This is a concept called retrieval, or chazara. It is the way God saves the sinner from the consequence of his sin. The way God returns the power to a person who has sinned and should lose his Kedusha. God returns it by giving it to someone else, and then through certain amount of atonement, suffering, or sorrow that he's caused by that individual, he gets it back. That is the principle of triangulation. It is that principle of triangulation which the Bonishim used to give the Jews all the power which was lost by the Goyim. What God did was simply choose a nation as a vessel nation, and he said, I will give 90% of the power of mankind, 90% of the power which I confiscated from all the nations of the world, right? From the Goyim. I will give this to one nation, and then I will take the Jews and I will put them into that nation, you see. And I will give them the chance to retrieve that power. How? Very basically. And this was the step. I will take the Jews and I will put them into this nation. When this nation has 90% of the Kedusha of the world, what does that mean? What kind of nation is that? It means that they will be the most powerful nation on earth in terms of their knowledge, their wisdom, and in terms of their power. The Jews will then go into that nation. The Jews will then go into that nation, and as they go into that nation, they will be seduced by the power and the wisdom of that nation. Because that nation, having the Kedusha of the world, will be an evil nation. You see, they will be an evil nation with the power, 90% of the power of the world. The Jews will be placed into the bosom of that nation, and that nation will attempt to entrap them and seduce them away from God. But if they sustain their belief in God, if they sustain their belief in God and attempt to do His will, then they will draw back that Kedusha from that nation, and they will have it in their hands. But if they don't sustain the entrapment of that nation, then that nation will have the power to dominate them and cause them suffering, and they will draw back the power through suffering. So we see, therefore, that the Jews can retrieve the power of the world, the power of Olam Haba, which was taken away from the Goyim, you see, and put into a one vessel nation by either remaining steadfast to the will of God, and if they fail that, then they would have to suffer at the hands of that nation. But in either one of these two scenarios, they will return the Kedusha of the world to them. Who was that nation? Egypt. Egypt was chosen as a nation that would be the repository of the Kedusha of all of mankind. That's why God said to Abraham, He said to Abraham, look, you have 10% of Olam Haba. I don't know exactly, 10%, whatever percentage it was. You have 10% of Olam Haba. You've got to get back the other 90%. Where is the other 90%? You've got to get the other 90% back, because if you don't get the 90% back, you won't even have your 10%, because Olam Haba is a structure of unity. You've got to get the 90% back. Where is it? It is in the land of Egypt. I have taken that 90% Kedusha and put in the land of Egypt. How? Because now that Egypt has that Kedusha, they are the most powerful nation on the world. They have the greatest witchcraft, the greatest magic that the world has ever seen. The Talmud says that when the witchcraft and the power of magic, the power of tumah, of darkness, was given to the world, the Egyptians took 9/10. and 1/10 was left for the rest of the world. Why did the Egyptians take 9/10? Because they took 9/10 of the power of the world, and they converted that power into the dark forces, because they were evil people. But that power was the power of Olam Haba. That's all it was. It wasn't some new strange power. The power of darkness that the Egyptians had, the power of magic that they had, was the power of Olam Haba in the hands of the Sultan. That's why it was witchcraft. That's why Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world. They were the conquerors of the world as well, and they had the greatest wisdom of the world at the time. So the Viking said to Abraham, I will put your children into the land of Egypt. And when they're in the land of Egypt, they will have to remain steadfast and not succumb to the idolatry, to the idol worship of Egypt. They must remain steadfast. If they do, then what will happen is they will slowly absorb the power of Egypt in their souls. And Egypt will fall to the wayside and they will capture the power. Not only will they have their own 10%, but they will have taken the 90% of Egypt. If they fail to remain steadfast, then Egypt will have a greater power over them. And Egypt will not only attempt to entrap them, but Egypt will literally enslave them. So the enslavement, which only occurred in the last 80 years, was only there because the Jews failed to what? They failed to remain steadfast, they failed to deny the seduction. That's why in the end they had to become slaves. Initially, you see, for the first 130 years, 120, 30 years, the Jews were not slaves. They were in Egypt, living in Egypt. And they were supposed to remain steadfast. They were supposed to what? Not to fall at the idolatrous worship of Egypt. Had they done that, they never would have been slaves. They would have gone out before the time. They would have never been slaves. You see, because they would have taken back the power of Egypt and the power of the world without slavery. They would have taken it back from Mesiras Nefesh. They would have taken it back by upholding the will of God, by holding on to Kedusha. But since they failed to do that, they had to become slaves and they had to suffer at the hands of Egypt. But that was the promise of God to Abraham, that one way or another they will take back that power. And they finally did. So that when the Jews left Egypt, they had that power in their hands. They had the power. You see, that's what they left Egypt for. When we thank God on Pesach, what we're thanking Him is an extraordinary thing. We're not so much thanking Him that we left Egypt as such, but we thank the Bonisham is that somehow the Bonisham gave us the opportunity to build all of Olam Haba, all of it. You see, and that He guaranteed to us that He gave us another mechanism to ensure by the fact that we will leave Egypt. Because even if we fail to abide by His will, even if we fall into the idolatrous practices of Egypt, you see, the Bonisham still made it possible that we would leave Egypt. And we would leave for the reason that we went in. And we didn't go in because we had to suffer for our own sins. We didn't go in because that's the way to build a nation. We went in so that we can what? We can earn and create the Olam Haba to its fullest extent. That's why we went in. And we thank the Bonisham that He allowed us to go out under all circumstances. That He allowed us to fulfill that opportunity. And then when we did leave, we had the power of the world in our hands. And the full possibility of Olam Haba. What was the next step? The next step was that we went to Sinai. We went to Har Sinai. And God gave us the Torah. It was the intention of God that when He gave us the Torah at that point, that Torah He gave us was the light of the Mashiach. It's not the Torah that you know of today. It was a Torah where the inner light shone throughout the surface. You see, so that when one looked into the Torah, he can understand the wisdom of all time. He would know exactly in every way how God designed the world the way He did, why He designed the world the way He did, and why everything transpired in human history. He would understand incredible mysteries and secrets just by reading the Torah, because it was at the surface, this knowledge. The first tablet that the Bonisham gave Moshe Rabbeinu was the light of the Mashiach. It was a Torah without any darkness at all. It was the intention of the Bonisham that Torah should bring in not only the redemption from Egypt, but the redemption from Olam Hazeh, this world, and usher in the Messianic period, and begin the next stage of the first beginning stages after that of Olam Haba. That was the intention. Now at that time, what the Gon Hashem did was he went to all the nations of the world. He went to all the nations of the world and he offered them the opportunity to take the Torah also. But don't kid yourself, the Torah that he offered them was not the same as what he offered the Jews, because how could he give the same offer to the Goyim when they already lost a great deal of it? But he did give them one last offer to at least retain some level of creativity, some level where they can create an Olam Haba on their own. He offered them the last minimal level which is possible for a person to do. And they said, no, we don't want it. We don't want to have anything to do with Olam Haba. So what the Gon Hashem said at that point, in that case, then you no longer can ever be involved in the creation of Olam Haba in any sense. And the Jews then, with that last denial, the Jews took the last piece of Kedusha and they controlled the entire access to Olam Haba. They had the keys to the gate. No one else can get in but them, or through them. And that was the final decree for the rest of time. But this was a very important thing. What I'd like to discuss now that we understand why the Jews were in Egypt, what they were supposed to be doing, and what God had intended, I'd like to have some kind of understanding of what happened in the redemption of Egypt. What was the battle against the Jews against Egypt? To try and understand what Moshe wanted, what was he telling to Egypt, to Pharaoh, to the Pharaoh of Egypt, what the meaning of the 10 plagues were. You see, what was going on over there, so that we have a better understanding of that. This is a very remarkable story, and the truth of the matter is, the understanding that I would like to present now is very different from the way most people really see it. How did most people really see it? Well, what's the story? God said to Moshe, go on to Pharaoh and tell him, let my people go. Moshe comes to Pharaoh, he declares there with his brother Aaron, and he says to Pharaoh, I have been instructed by the Gon Hashem, the creator of the world, let my people go. Pharaoh says, who is this God? I never heard of him. So Moshe says, you may not have heard of him, but I will demonstrate his power. He goes over to the Nile River, Aaron raises his staff, suddenly the whole Nile turns into blood. Neat trick. The Egyptians see this, and they say, we're not that impressed. They say, we should do the same thing. And they're able to turn water into blood too. Okay. Next step. Moshe goes to Pharaoh and says, you haven't let my children go. If you don't let them go, I'm going to raise frogs from the earth, and they'll be all over the place. Pharaoh says, nothing doing. He raises frogs. The land of Egypt is filled with frogs. The Egyptians and magicians look around. Yeah, remember, they had 90% of the power in the world. They're looking at him and say, impressive, but we can do the same thing. And they're able to raise frogs as well. Next step, Moshe comes back and says to them, you haven't let my people go. How about it this time? Pharaoh says, nothing doing. Suddenly he raises lights from the world. The Egyptians look at him and say, you have it. There is nothing in all of Egyptian power that is able to raise lights or anything smaller than a certain measure. A louse is so small that tissue or witchcraft does not have control over that type of creature. So the Egyptians, the magicians go to the God and say to them, they go to Pharaoh and they say, Pharaoh, this man means business. This is no ordinary individual. Whatever he's doing, and we don't know what it is more powerful than we have. And the magicians say, very important phrase, they say, Etzba Elokim. It is the finger of God. In other words, whatever he's doing, it's coming from that deity in whose name he is spoken. Now at that point, Pharaoh was nervous, real nervous. So what God says to Moshe, I will harden the heart of Pharaoh, so that he will not let you go. Because under normal conditions, Pharaoh should have let the Jews go. But God says, it is too late, Pharaoh. He had enough choices. Now that he's failed, these 3 times, or these 2 times, he will no longer be able to release the Jews. And I will keep him there. I will allow him to keep the Jews till 10 plagues. And I will show Pharaoh who I really am. Okay? Moshe then goes over the 10 plagues. All of them. Always, he brings many wild animals on the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt is covered with wild animals. Dever, plague. A plague which kills all the animals. Shrin, saras, boils, and skin discolorations. The Egyptians have incredible boils all over them. Borah, hail. Arber, grasshoppers, locusts. Choshech, total darkness, midday, with the sun at noon. Absolute darkness on the face of Egypt. So that was so thick, they literally could not stand up from their chairs because they couldn't walk around even. Finally, Makat B'cheres, the death of every firstborn son of Egypt. What was really happening here? What was the conflict between Moshe and Paro? And what is all this happening, and why does God harden the heart of Paro suddenly? We want to see some kind of real understanding of this entire process. Normally, how do most people look at this entire conflict between Paro and Moshe? Very basically, Moshe comes over to Paro and says, look, let my people go, because God, the Lord commanded me to tell you, let my people go, so we can go to this mountain and serve him. And Paro says, I don't want to let them go. So Moshe says, you don't want to let them go? Then what he calls them, what I'm going to do to you is I'm going to punish you and your nation. And I'm going to show you that we're stronger than you. But this is strange. What does he do at the outset? He begins to demonstrate certain miracles or certain plagues that the Egyptians themselves can do. And then finally Moshe begins to take certain plagues that the Egyptians cannot do. But the question that we have to ask, it would seem that the whole conflict between Moses and Pharaoh, or Moshe and Pharaoh, was to get the Jews out. You see. But this is called a sledgehammer approach. In other words, I say do it my way, you don't want to do it my way, and you take a hammer and you knock it over the guy's head. That seems to be what it is. It's a sledgehammer approach. That seems to be what the conflict is there. Moshe says the Bereshit wants it one way, and Pharaoh says I don't want to do it your way. So Moshe says I'm going to show that I'm stronger than you, and I'm going to convince you that you must let the Jews. Until Pharaoh finally says, look, take them out. After Makat B'cheres, Pharaoh says, look, take them out. It's enough. I've had enough. But the truth of the matter is, this is not the way it happens at all. No way. It had nothing to do with this. Moshe was not trying to convince Pharaoh by punishing the Egyptians to let the Jews out. That's not what happened. Why? For one simple reason. The time of the redemption had come. The time of the redemption had come to the Jews. Do we understand this? When Moshe went to Pharaoh, he went over to Pharaoh and he says, I want you to know, the Jews have to leave Egypt. So Pharaoh said to him, what do you mean they have to leave Egypt? I have the power of the world. 90% of the power of the world is mine. I don't know anything about your Jews having to leave. There's no way they can leave because their power, I have that power. So Moshe says, no, you don't have that power. You had that power. You had it. Because what it was is that they were supposed to be in your land for 210 years. Either through refusing to give into your idolatrous practices or suffering through slavery. But once they did that, once they suffered through slavery, you no longer had the power over them. So Paul says, what do you mean I no longer have power over them? What does that mean? So what Moshe says is because now that the time is over, you have no more Kedusha. All the Kedusha is back in the hands of the Jews. That's what Moshe said. You don't have the Kedusha anymore. You don't have the power over them anymore. The Jews have taken it back all. They've retrieved the entire thing through the 210 years that you've been there. So Paul says, I don't believe this. So Moshe says, I'll prove it to you. What's my proof? The 10 plagues. The 10 plagues were not the way that Moshe forced Pharaoh to release the Jews. The 10 plagues were the demonstration or the revelation to Pharaoh that the Jews have to leave because they can leave whether you like it or not. Because they have the power. You no longer have the power to retain them. You see, this is the key idea. So what happened? What Moshe then goes over and says, but I will show it to you. I will show it to you that you no longer have the power because I will teach you who God really is. Because Paul says, I don't know anything about this God of the Jews. I never heard of him. All I know is the power that we have. We have the enormous power of the whole world. We are the greatest nation in our world in terms of magic and witchcraft. And I never heard about you, this God, or this God that has this other power. I don't know of it. So the Moshe Rabbeinu said, I'm going to teach you about this God. I'm going to teach you about this God, and I'm going to teach you what this was all about, what this enslavement was all about. But I'm going to teach you in levels. And at the beginning, I'm going to give you free will. I'm going to let you make the choice. So what Moshe did was, he turned the Nile into blood. So Paul looks at that and says, I don't see any power of a God. Why do I see power of God? We can do that also. If we can do that also, then you're just nothing more than a good magician. You're as good as us. Maybe you're better than us. But obviously you must be a witch or you must be a magician too. You must be taking your power from the same way we are. You see. And that's what Paul really believes. So he says, I'm not interested in letting the Jews go. You see. He had the free will at that point to decide that he wants to let the Jews go on his own. But what Moshe did not want to give him the full awareness yet of how lost he really was, or that the fact that he really no longer had the Kedusha. So first Moshe uses a power which is very similar to the Egyptians, because they can do it too. The next Svardeya flogs, and Moshe says, I'll do something else. He does flogs, and the magicians of Egypt say, we can do the same thing. So they sit down and they say, wait a minute. What is this God? This God is obviously a God of magic, or a God of like we, the God of darkness. It's the same God. He's not talking about a different God, because we can do the same thing. He is accessing the same power as us. You see. So Paul thinks about it and says, well, wait a minute. If we're going to access the same power as them, all he is a good magician like us. He's better than us. You see. Because obviously he seems to be more powerful than us. I'm not going to let the Jews go because I want to keep them. So suddenly at this point, Moshe introduces a new revelation called kingdom. And suddenly the Egyptians sit down life, and the Egyptians sit down and understand that they don't have the power to control life. They even know such thing as the magical world, or the forces of darkness that can control a creature that small. And the magicians run over to Paul and said, no, this is not another magician. He is using some force which is beyond our ability. We don't know what that force is. Obviously, he's got another God somewhere. Another power that we've never seen or heard of. So Paul suddenly realizes that he's up against a much more powerful force than he ever saw. But it's too late because the free will of Paul is gone. And what happens? One plague after another. Each plague reveals the fact that Egypt no longer has the ability, you see, to keep Israel. But the greatest of all lessons has yet to be taught to Pharaoh. The most powerful lesson of all, and the most shocking revelation. The last truth, Choshech and Bechorus. The plague of darkness and the plague of the killing of the firstborn. These were the most astonishing revelations to Pharaoh. You have to understand that when Moshe suddenly turned off the light of the sun in the middle of the day, it was the fact that Pharaoh realized that Moshe was using another force. It was much deeper. It was traumatic for Pharaoh. And then when Moshe killed the firstborn, this was the most traumatic event that Pharaoh and his magicians ever saw. Why? Now listen very carefully, and you'll see amazing things. Do you know what God the Egyptians worshipped? The God of the sun. Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was the God of the sun, the ram. You know what the month of the year, the astrological sign of the ram? Nisan, April. The Egyptians were the most powerful nation in the world. They had 90% of the power of the universe in their hands, the spiritual power. Therefore, they were connected to the most powerful astrological sign of all, the sun. The power, when God sends down His powers, the powers that God sends down goes through the various different astrological signs. The zodiac. But the most powerful heavenly body that the power of God descends through is the sun. Since Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world, they knew magically, they knew that somehow their power was connected to the disk of the sun. We don't understand this, because this knowledge is lost. As I said a long time ago, the power of this magic, the power of Kishul, and the power of astrology, all these things that they once were able to do, we no longer have this chokhmah. We no longer have this wisdom. But in those days, they were able to do it. And they knew, the Egyptian magicians knew that the power of Egypt lay in the sun. So they worshipped the sun. And therefore their month was the month of Nisan. It was their month, it was the month of the Egyptians. When the Bereshit said to Moshe, take my people, I want my people to go out, he told Moshe that the Jews now have the power of the world. What does that mean? That they have the power of the sun. And the month of Nisan is theirs. So Moshe went along the power and he said the following, and listen very carefully. He said, at first we started with blood, turning the Nile into blood and frogs. And with that I simply wanted to show you that I was at least as powerful as you. You thought that all I was another fasting magician. So what I did was I went to the next several different plagues. The next 6 plagues. And the next 6 plagues you all saw that you had no ability to do them. So therefore you suddenly realized that I had access to a power which is greater than your power. You all knew that. But you don't know where that power came from. Not only that, you thought that you are also powerful, except that I have a stronger power. But now I want to tell you an amazing thing. You know where my power is? My power is the God who created the world. And you know where your power comes from? You know where your witchcraft comes from and your magic? It comes from my power. I'm not a person that accesses a power which is different than yours, but stronger. I access the source of all power, the source even of your power. I'm going to show you where magic comes from. I'm going to show you where tumor comes from and all the dark forces. I'm going to show you that the darkest forces and all the tumor and kishuf that you have comes from the same God that I'm talking about. That this God is not a God who's separate from your powers and therefore you have your own power separate from Him. But I'm going to show you that the power of darkness comes from the power of light. So power says, how can you demonstrate that? You show me that you access another power which is greater than mine. But how can you tell me that my power comes from your power? So Moshe says, watch. He flipped the switch and the sun turned off. But what was the sun? The sun was the power of Egypt. So as soon as power saw this, he says, my God, she says, this guy's got his hand on my plug. He's not using another machine. First we thought he was using my machine. And then we thought he was using another machine, which is stronger than my machine. But I see now that he's using our machine from the backside. He's got his fingers in the circuits of our machine. Because how did he shut off the sun? Moshe didn't only shut off the sun, that was a physical thing. But he shut off the spiritual power of Egypt. So that suddenly when power and the magicians sat down and they were traumatized because they realized the greatest Gilui Yichud, the greatest revelation of God's power. What's the greatest revelations of God's unity? Ain't no Novado, there is no one else but God. And what do the sages say? Even with witchcraft. In other words, there is no power but God, even when it comes to magic. Because the power of magic and the power of witchcraft, even though it looks like it can defy God, is the will of God. That's the greatest unity. That's how we know Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. There's only one God. Because God is behind both good and evil. You know when Paul learned that? Marcus Kosher. Paul learned, the Pharaoh learned in the plague of darkness. When Moshe shut off the sun, what Paul understood, something he never understood before for the first time, that the power of darkness and the power of evil is from the power of God. It is the same thing. And that totally paralyzed him. That's what Moshe demonstrated with the plague of darkness. But wait. When you're about to take over a kingdom, when you go over to a king who has a throne and he has a castle and he has a city and a fortress, and you say to him, I want to take over your throne. What's the first thing you have to do? The first thing you have to do is destroy his army and enter into the fortress, right? What's the second thing you have to do is then enter into the palace and take the king and throw him out of the throne, and you take his throne and put it on your own head. Right? When Moshe demonstrated the plague of darkness, he destroyed Pharaoh's army. Because he showed Pharaoh that your force is really my force. Makas Bechoros is the exchange of the crown. Why does he change the crown? Who's the first man that was ever created? Adam. the first man. You know what a Bechor is? A Bechor is the firstborn. But it doesn't mean it's the firstborn literally. The first opening of the womb of a woman is called the Bechor. The first time a woman conceives is called the Bechor. And if that birth is a son, he is the Bechor. What is the Bechor? What's the distinction of a firstborn son? What's the big deal? Well, it is the following, that if a woman has, at the first delivery, a son, that son has a different neshama than all the other children. That's the Katz Bechor. That neshama is greater than all the other children after that. There is something about being the firstborn of a woman that entitles you to a neshama which is greater. Because that neshama is greater, it has a higher spiritual task. For example, Esav and Jacob. Who was the Bechor? Esav was the Bechor. Why did Yaakov have to buy the Bechor, the birthright from Esav, if he was the biggest tzaddik? Because since Esav was born first, his neshama in a certain way was higher than Yaakov's. Just by the fact that he was first, he was the Bechor. So Yaakov had to exchange that and acquire the spiritual power from Esav. So we see. How do you know if there's a Bechor or not? If you see a person, a certain man, can you tell if he's a Bechor or not? No. But if you have access to spiritual powers, or you can understand spiritual things, if you are high enough and you are Kurdish, you can look at his neshama and you can say, that's the Bechor. Because there's something about the neshama of a Bechor which is different than the neshama of others. So a Bechor is a spiritual factor in the neshama of a person. Who was the first product of God? Who is the Bechor of God? Adam Rishon. Adam Rishon is the Bechor of the world. He's the firstborn of God. And that's why Adam Rishon neshama was the greatest of all. We see. When Hashem fragmented Adam, that power then went into the firstborn child. You see. Now what happened is that when God finally decided to give the nation of Egypt all the power of the world, Egypt became the Bechor of the world. Egypt was the firstborn of God, because Egypt inherited 90% of the power of the world. Because 90% of the power of the world, which used to be in Adam, now was in the hands of Egypt. So Egypt was the firstborn of the world. But God said to Abraham, I want you to be the firstborn of the world. But you must take that birthright from Egypt. Power understood that. Power knew that they were the most powerful nation on earth. But Power thought that they were the most powerful nation on earth because they had usurped an incredible amount of power. Moshe came and says, you know where you're getting your power? It's not your power. That power comes from the evil of the world. And it is time for you to give it up. And Power said that's impossible. So Moshe said, I will prove it to you. I will prove it to you the plagues. These 10 plagues are not means to coerce you to give up the Jews. Because you have to give up the Jews. You no longer have the power to attain them. These 10 plagues is the way I'm going to teach you or reveal to you that you are impotent and you are powerless to stop me. You see, I don't have to force you to give up the Jews because they're lost already. I'm simply going to teach you that you no longer have them. And these 10 plagues are the revelation of your impotence. You see, that's the thing. By the time Moshe Rabbeinu got down to Machat Choshech, Moshe said, I'm going to reveal to you that the power that you have is not even your own power. It's my power. It's the power of God. And suddenly the world went dark, or Egypt went dark. And then finally, after that happened, Pharaoh stood there and Moshe said, now that you know who God is, now that you know that the power is no longer yours, one more thing remains. I will take your crown. Literally. I will take it. How will I take it? I will show you that every firstborn of Egypt who has that power will no longer live. Why will they die? Because they will have given up the power of the Bechor. The death of the firstborn of Egypt is not Moshe Rabbeinu suddenly coming along, killing all the firstborn. Every firstborn of Egypt dies automatically, and the power of Egypt automatically transferred to the Jews. Every firstborn of Egypt automatically and spontaneously died. You see what it was? It wasn't that God says, I will punish the Egyptians and I will kill the firstborn of Egypt as a lesson to force power to give up the Jews. Moshe said, no, with the last and the 10th plague, I'm going to show you that the game is over. You've lost. We are the Bechor. So Paro said to him, how are you going to show me that? Watch. And suddenly, every Bechor of Egypt died. Right in front of his eyes. Why did they die? Because the whole Kedusha simply transferred to the Jews. Do we see what happened? This is really what was going on. Paro was flabbergasted. In fact, the truth of the matter is, Paro knew what was coming. As soon as he saw that Moshe had his hands on his plug, unplugged his machine, he knew it was all over. But he was afraid to admit the last thing, the crown, you see. Who killed every firstborn of Egypt? The Malach HaMavet. How does the Malach HaMavet know every firstborn of Egypt? You know, that's a very strange plague. You know what I mean? Normally when you have a plague, how do you spread a plague? A plague is spread through how? Through some kind of contagion and so on and so forth. But this plague, right, kills out every firstborn of Egypt. But how does a plague know who the firstborn of Egypt is? You know what I mean? The firstborn of Egypt is a spiritual quality. The last plague of Makat Bechiris, the death of the firstborn, was a spiritual plague. The Malach HaMavet threw every Bechor of Egypt because he simply looked at the soul and said, that's the Bechor. It was a spiritual plague. It was death by soul. Death by the criteria of your soul. If you had the soul of the Bechor, you died. You see. Why? Because suddenly the power was sucked out of you and given to the Jews. Who? It was given to the firstborn of the Jews. You see. It was like suddenly some huge vacuum cleaner came down in Egypt, you see. And the vacuum cleaner had a sensing device to spot every Bechor in Egypt. And therefore were able to spot the 90% of the Kedusha that Egypt possessed, that they were about to lose. And the vacuum cleaner was put on and then sucked it all up and simply transferred to every Bechor of the Jews, and every Bechor of Egypt suddenly dropped dead. Do you see how it worked? That's how the plague worked. There was no strange mystery of it. It was simply the transference of power from one repository to the other. Because that power is the power of Olam Haba. That was the final revelation. And what Moshe said, you see, I'm right. You have learned an incredible lesson, Paro. You have learned that when I said to you, let my people go, I wasn't asking you to do me a favor. It wasn't that I said to you, please let my people go. I was coming to you from the beginning because Boruch wanted to give you free will. He wanted to give you a last chance so that you'll let the people of Israel go by your own will. But it wasn't your choice to keep them or not. What Moshe said is, it's our choice. They're no longer yours. But the Boruch was courteous enough to give you the last chance, at least let you contribute to the redemption of the Jews. It was simply a courtesy that God extended to you. But those Jews are out of your hands already. So when Paro said no, the first and second time, Moshe said, okay, that's it. God confiscates. God now takes back that courtesy. And you will lose the Jews whether you like it or not. But I'm going to teach you who God is as you lose them. That was the lesson of the 10 plagues. It was the revelation of who God is. That God is the power behind all powers. And it was the revelation to Egypt that when the time comes, when the Kedusha is gone, nothing in heaven and earth can stop it. It goes automatically, spontaneously, by itself. What is matzah about? We eat matzah. Why do we eat matzah and we cannot see chametz? Chametz is bread, but what is the difference between chametz and matzah? What is the difference between these two? Chametz is bread which has leaven in it, with yeast, so that there's carbon dioxide and the bread expands. Matzah is bread which is not expanded. It's the same thing. One has been expanded through carbon dioxide, the other one has not. One has been fermented, the other one has not. What's the difference? The difference is this. The difference is that chametz is bread. The expansion blows the bread up so that it looks much bigger, really. But that expansion is gaseous. It's not substantive. That's what the Yetzer Hara is about. That's what Tumah is about. Tumah enters into something and it looks like you're much bigger than you are. So that the bread that was given, or the bread that people eat, you see, is like what? It's like the pleasures of the guf. It tastes good, but it has the Yetzer on in it. It's hidden. Matzah is bread of the soul, because it has no leaven in it. It has nothing, it has no gaseous expansion. So therefore, it is pure dough, you see. But matzah is something you can only eat when you're on a certain level. When God said to the Jews, I want you to eat matzah and not hummus, God told the Jews that you had reached a certain level. You have reached a level where you are capable of eating food without a Yetzer Hara. Because there is no more Yetzer Hara as far as you're concerned. You have left it behind in Egypt. You have sucked the Yetzer Hara dry. You have impoverished the Yetzer Hara himself. Not only have you impoverished Egypt, but you have impoverished the Sultan himself. And there is no Kedusha left there, because you have taken with you. Makas B'choros has given you every ounce of not only the power of Egypt, but the power of the Sultan, so that he can no longer go and accuse you for the redemption of yours. And because of the redemption of yours, you are now capable of eating of foods which will reflect your spiritual state. And that's a state where you exist without a Yetzer Hara on your back, without someone accusing you and trying to take away your Kedusha. You see. Now the Haggadah says that the reason why we eat matzah is because the Jews did not have enough time to bake bread. You see. They didn't have enough time to bake bread. What is the meaning of that? Because what the Rebbe is wanting to show is the following: that when it comes time for the redemption, you've got to go quickly. Even if it's in the middle of the night. You see. What does that mean when it comes time for redemption? The redemption occurs at the midnight. That was the last second that the accusation of the Sultan required the Jew to be in Egypt. 1 second before midnight, there was an ounce of Kedusha left in Egypt. The next second after midnight, Egypt was empty. If Egypt is empty, there's not a reason to stay 1 more second. Leave. You're free. You're free because you have the power. Egypt is powerless. You have the power, you see. That's why that second was the critical second. And God says to the Jew, leave now. But wait, why did they have time to what? To bake bread. Why not? If they stood in Egypt for so many years, they sure will have time to bake a little bread. Because what God was telling the Jews is why they were redeemed. Because if the Jews had left Egypt through their deeds and through the fact that they did not listen to the idolatry of Egypt, then they would have chosen the hour of their redemption. Because they would have created redemption by their own deeds. But the Jews failed to do it even in Egypt. So God had to redeem them because of the promise He made to the forefathers. You see. But when God has to redeem the Jews because of a promise that He made, then you have to leave when God tells you to leave, not when you want to leave. You see. So they didn't even have enough time because God's saying, leave now. Why? Because now the time is over. Why? Because I have set the time. And I have seen to it that the time has arrived. Therefore you must go. If you had seen to it that the time had arrived, things would have been different. You see. But you don't even have enough time to bake bread. Because the hour has arrived through me and not through you. You see. So we see that the redemption of Egypt was through the chesed of the Rebbe Shalom. It was loving kindness. And basically not through our own real effort. Except that, even then, there was one more trial that the Jews had before they left. When the Jews were about to leave Egypt, before, the Sultan ran up to the guard and said, why are these Jews leaving Egypt? Why? Why? The Egyptians worship idols, and the Jews worship the same idols. So why are you distinguishing between them? So the Rebbe said, you're right. We have to give them one last test. And the test was that the Rebbe said that they are commanded every Jew, right? And said the following. Why is this holiday called Pesach? Why? This holiday is called Pesach. The word Pesach means to pass over. Why? Because what happened is that on the night of Makas B'choros, when God killed the firstborn of Egypt, right? What the Jews did was they slaughtered a lamb. All of the Jews slaughtered a lamb, and then they dipped into that blood, and they put it on their doorpost, the lintel, on their doorpost. And with the blood on the doorpost, which came from that sacrifice of the lamb, the Malach HaMolos passed them by. He passed over their house. What is the meaning of Pesach? What is that? Because the truth of the matter is, the Jews could not leave Egypt by their own merit. They couldn't. They had to do one thing on their own to leave Egypt by their own merit. And what was that? God gave them one last chance to choose between him and Egypt. And he said, I want you to sacrifice a sheep. But wait a minute, the sheep is the ram. The ram is the god of Egypt. Which means that if suddenly all the Jews would start running off, sacrificing rams, the Egyptians would get very furious. But the Buddha said, that's your ultimate historian. That's your ultimate test. You want to know if you're going to get the crown? I will not give you the crown of Egypt until you first deny the God of Egypt. Until you say, Amun-Ra is not the God. Amun-Ra, the power of Amun-Ra comes from the power of God. If you commit yourself to that statement, that God is greater than Amun-Ra, because God controls Amun-Ra, the power of the sun is the power of God, then I will give you their crown. But in order to do that, you must sacrifice their God, and the God who you worship up to now. So the Jews went ahead and they sacrificed the ram, they sacrificed the sheep. And by doing that, they put themselves under intimidation to the Egyptians, because they allowed themselves possibly to what? The Egyptians to take revenge, you see. But they did it, because they were saying to the Egyptians for the last time, we shun the gods of Egypt. We shun Ra, Amun-Ra. And we will sacrifice the ram, or we sacrifice the sheep to show you that we choose God and not Amun-Ra. So God said to them, if you do that, then take the blood of the sacrifice and put it over your doorstep. And put it over the lintel. And by doing that, then the Malach HaMolech will pass over Egypt and transfer the power from every firstborn of Egypt to every firstborn of the Jew. And the firstborn of the Jews will not die, because they will have the blood of what? They will have the blood of the ram on their door. And that will testify that the Jews have committed the final test to be worthy of being the firstborn. Do we see? That's why it's called Pesach. Because the reason why we finally left Egypt had to do that we finally shunned the gods of Egypt by the last great act, which is the Pesach. When we sacrificed the ram of Egypt, when we sacrificed the sheep of Egypt, we told God that we will put ourselves in jeopardy, but keep the will of God, and we will deny the gods of Egypt. That gave us the merit of the schus for Makas Bechoros. It gave us the merit which then allowed the transfer to take place. And that merit was placed on every door of the Jews as a sign that when the Sultan, or the Malach HaMolech, went to Egypt, he looked at the doors of the Jews and he looked at the doors of the Egyptians. He saw the firstborn of the Jews and the firstborn of Egypt. And he had to choose. And the Sultan says, wait a minute, I should take both of these. Both of them have sinned against you. That's what he said to God. So the Baruch says, true, both houses, the Jewish house and the Egyptian house, worship Amun-Ra. But look again. Look at the top of the lintel. Do you see that? You see that blood? That blood comes from the sacrifice of Amun-Ra. And that sacrifice gives them the merit where you no longer have dominion over them. So therefore, go to the Egyptians instead and transfer the power to the Jews. You see that? That's why this holiday is called Pesach. Because it is the final usurpation of the power of Egypt. It's the way that we took the power of Egypt through the most important merit of all, the denial of Amun-Ra and the gods of Egypt. And the Sultan had no power over us because of that final merit. That's why it's called Pesach. And that's why in the Seder we celebrate. We have a certain part that celebrates the Korban Pesach, or the Paschal Lamb. But that's the concept behind the Paschal Lamb. This last plague of Egypt, the plague of Bechoros, could not have transpired until the Jews had earned the final merit which will allow them to defend themselves against the accuser, to defend themselves against the Sultan, that they were different than the Egyptians. You see. And then, as soon as that was done, God said, transfer the power from the Bechor, from the firstborn of the Egyptians to the firstborn of the Jew. And the Jews were taken out with that last merit. Finally, Moror. We understand now what Mass is about. We understand what the Pesach is about, the Korban Pesach. Right? Moror. We eat bitter herbs. Why? Why do we eat bitter herbs? to commemorate the fact that we suffered a great deal in Egypt. Why do we commemorate the fact that we suffered? To learn one thing. What Morah teaches us is the following: that suffering leads to redemption. That we thought that when we suffered in Egypt, we thought that we were lost. We thought that we were slaves and we would never be free. But what Bereshit is teaching us is that that suffering was the key to the triangulation process. How did we retrieve the power of Egypt? How? Besides the last merit of the Korban Pesach, how do we fundamentally reduce Egypt to an ash heap? How do we take out the 90% of the power of Egypt? You see, how? By the slavery in Egypt. That was the final instrument. And that even though we thought that the slavery in Egypt was our punishment, we thought that it was our suffering, we thought that it was our end, it was really the way God fulfilled His promise, Avom, that He would guarantee it, that the Jews would retrieve 90% of the power of the world. That's what the Morah is. The bitter herbs. The bitter herbs is not a commemoration that we suffered in Egypt, but that God has the ability to use suffering to bring the redemption. And that suffering was the final way, the final instrument in which the retrieval took place. And that the essence of going into Egypt was the retrieval. It's by taking the Kedusha from Egypt, by taking the Kedusha which Egypt got from the sins of mankind before it, by taking the Kedusha which represented 90% of what? Of the Kedusha of the world, and therefore allowing us to have it. Egypt was simply the vessel or the vehicle. It was the instrument to transfer this incredible power, 90% of the power of the world, from the Goyim who lost it to the Jews who then can claim all of Olam Haba with it. Let's end this year with the hope that this will be the last Pesach. That this Pesach should be the last Pesach in the sense that we should no longer have to concern ourselves of the first redemption because we will be intimately involved in the final redemption.